Well, that's good. That's something everybody should know. Well, we're about 6:30 right now. Uh, James, you would you like to go ahead and introduce Jim for us? And
Okay. Yeah. Uh, so we're really excited to welcome Jim Landers. Jim Landers has been a close personal friend of mine for what, 12 or 13 years now. And then,
It's been a while.
yeah, we've known each other for a while. We're a sponsor of an organization called Photo SA, which is a local photography club. It's actually probably the largest, or at least one of the largest photography clubs in the area. And Jim runs that the club. It's through Meetup. So if anyone's interested, it's meetup.com/photosa. And one of the things that Jim has been doing for a number of years now is he's been offering photography classes, and he's really built up quite a setup with teaching photography. And when I first met Jim, Jim had Landers Photography, but now it's Landers Photography School, which is really the bulk of what Jim does now. And Jim has been teaching photographers for how many years? No, how many years have you been teaching?
Started in 1997, so 23 years.
So, and he's created a lot of successful photographers, but it's not just creating successful photographers from a business standpoint. Is he's created a lot of successful photographers by teaching people that want to be photographers how to use their camera, the basics. And one of the things I've noticed about Jim since I've known him is he really strongly believes in sticking with the basics, because that's, what makes a good photographer. And I don't know what else I can say, but I think that's pretty good introduction there. At least I hope so. And also to everyone within the chat, Jim has posted a kind of a summary of what he's going to be covering. It's a downloadable PDF, so you can access that. And I'll go ahead and let Jim take it from here.
all right, Jim. And
Well, thank you, James, and thank you, Melissa. I appreciate that introduction, James. Thank you very much. The handout that James just mentioned, I just put it on the chat. So if you've got your chat window open, or if you don't have it, open it, and it should be sitting there in your chat window. And I know that Marcy would like to go over photographing art outdoors for prints. It's not really part of what I was going to say, but it goes along real well with it. So maybe I should incorporate it, Marcy. Thank you for asking. So if you guys have that, you can take a look at it or print it right there where you're at. If not, I'm just going to share my screen and let you guys see what I'm talking about. So,
and I'll also make that available as a link on our YouTube and our Facebook as well.
Perfect. I just shared the wrong one with you. All right. All right, so that should be the right one. Yep, it is. Now, someone comes in after I posted that, they won't see that in their chat. And so maybe every once in a while, I need to post that back up there again.
Okay.
But you can absolutely follow along. You should be able to see my screen right now with the handout on it. Is that what you're seeing?
Yes, I am.
Awesome. All right. So I say this is the camera basics like you've never heard them before, mostly because this is camera basics to me. But as I've taught it over the years, what I have found is this is different than what people have heard before. And so, yes, it's camera basics, but it's probably different than what you've heard before. This reminds me of a time several years ago. This is probably, maybe 15 years, maybe 20 years. It's been some time. Not 20, but maybe 15, where a student came in for a session, and this was a private. A lot of the classes I do are groups, but this one was a private. I do a lot of private classes and coaching as well, especially for businesses. But for this particular student, they were coming in from out of town, and instead of doing it our normal way, they asked if we could do this series of classes all in one day. And I said, well, it's too much to do in one day, but let's do 2 days. And so she came in on one Saturday and came in on another Saturday. And on that first Saturday, we started with the camera basics, and I started going through it all, and she seemed to be very interested. And when it came down to the end, I said, did we cover everything that we wanted to cover? And what do you want to do? Is there something that I haven't covered yet that you want to make sure that I include next week? And she said, well, I didn't want to stop you, but we weren't actually going over the class that I thought we were going to be going over. She said, I came here for weddings. And I said, why didn't you say something to me? She said, because you teach the basics so differently than I've ever heard before that I just couldn't stop you. And this was interesting because she went on to say, and I am the photography teacher I'm not going to mention what town she's in because that might give away who she is, but I'm the photography teacher in the university that's in the town that I live in. And so from that point on, I realized I teach this differently than other people do. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody sees it quite differently. There's probably quite a few that see it exactly the same way, and it's the basics. So the parts that we're going to be talking about are the same, no matter what camera model we're talking about. But I do see this differently because I have been interested in photography and studying photography since 1976. And your response should be, oh, you don't look old enough to be able to have done that long. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So, but I've been studying photography since 1976. I got a degree in photography in 1991 from Sam Houston State in Huntsville. And I've been a full-time photographer since then, since 1991. And I've been teaching since 97. I started teaching in 97 because someone pushed me into it. Not because I thought I was good enough, because I seriously did not think I was good enough. A photographer who, and this person was in the advertising business, but wanted to add in photography to what she does. And so she asked me if I would teach her a class, and I declined. I said, no, I'm not good enough because I'm only 6 years into doing this full time. And so I was looking at people who were better than me thinking, well, these guys are better than I am. You probably should go to them. I'm still looking up at people. So therefore I really am not qualified. And she looked at me and kind of like she wanted to shake me. She didn't do anything, just kind of stared at my eyes for a second, make sure I was being serious, I guess, and said, you have a degree in photography, right? Yeah. You've been doing this 6 years, right? Yeah. I haven't been doing this at all. Do you really think there's nothing that you could teach me? Epiphany moment. I never thought of it that way. I was thinking about who was better than me and what I wanted to aspire to. It never crossed my mind that I had something to share. And so now I recommend to everyone, when you learn something, share it. Let the world know about it. This is good stuff. You know some little piece at the very least that someone else doesn't. Share it with them. And so she talked me into teaching a class, and it was a camera basics class. Basically, it was 4 or 6 hours. I don't recall total time, maybe 8. And it's kind of like my Photo 101 is now. My Photo 101 is 6 2-hour sessions, a 12-hour class. And it's quite different now than it was then because it's gone through several revisions. But I like making sure that people have a good solid foundation in photography before they move forward. There's so much to learn. And by the way, not to overwhelm you, not to surprise you, but there is so much to learn about photography that if you stopped everything and studied photography 100% of the time for the rest of your life, you would still not learn all there is to learn about photography. Yes, I've been studying photography since 1976. And the one major thing that I've learned is the more I learn, the more I realize there is to learn. Photography is a never-ending thing. But if you've got a good, strong foundation, you can do pretty much everything. There's a lot of photographers that have some kind of talent in photography. And you can be what I call a spike learner in photography and be a successful photographer, where you've got a large foundation, but you've only studied one spike or maybe two spikes in it. And those things you're pretty darn good at. But the rest, no, you stay away from, and that's fine. Perfectly fine. But I still believe that we all should know the basics, at least what I'm going to share with you tonight, actually a little bit more. The handout, if you have it, is probably more stuff that we can cover in this time that we have together. But if you've got it, you can still look into it. I do have a homework assignment because I believe in homework assignments. I believe that you can have intellectual knowledge that is strong, but practical knowledge, the ability to actually apply what it is that you've learned, nowhere near as strong. We can watch a YouTube video and think, I've got it. And then actually try to do it yourself and realize, I don't have it. I thought I knew it. I thought I knew what this is about. I really felt strongly about that. But now I realize it's not the case. And so a good, strong foundation helps with that. So let's get into this handout. And let me post it one more time.
Okay.
If anyone has come in since we started.
And I'm sharing it
So,
with them privately as they request it. So.
Oh, okay. Perfect. Very good. Thank you, Melissa, for doing that.
No problem. And just one more time to remind everybody to ask questions and stuff, just go ahead and get into the chats, whether it be on YouTube or on the Zoom. I'm monitoring those and I will let Jim know. And Jim, I don't know if you got to see your compliment there. They really don't think you're old enough looking to be having that much that big of a background in photography. So I say own that compliment there.
Over here dancing. No one can see me except for you guys. So.
The whole wide world, Jim. But
we'll I know, right?
We'll let you go ahead and start that. And if anybody has questions, just drop them right in onto the comments or the chat.
Please do. Please do. Well, this camera basic class, it's all about getting to know you and know the camera and become comfortable with some of the most basic tools in photography. You'll become aware of some very effective, practical, and easy to use techniques that photographers use to create amazing images. We'll cover the options and buttons that are found on all cameras, and such as auto mode, the 3 program modes, shutter speeds, aperture, ISO, menu items, and several other things. So do you think that DSLRs, so for purposes of this class, a DSLR is a camera that has an interchangeable lens, but we're also talking about mirrorless too. But do you think that digital SLRs take good pictures? Well, if you haven't discovered it yet, you'll be disappointed to find out that photographs created with a DSLR don't turn out much different than ones taken with a cheap point and shoot camera, unless you know how to use it. Generally speaking, all cameras are the same. Sure, there are differences like color, shape, size, location of buttons, image sensor quality, order of the menu items, the size of the LCD screen, the number of options. Keep on going. But if you know the basics of cameras, then you know how to use any camera. Then it's just a matter of locating the buttons on a camera. Learning only one camera, getting specific about one camera is great for that one camera. But learning how to use all cameras will make you better at using those cameras quickly. It's kind of like driving a car. If you have a Ford and you get into a Toyota, are you going to be able to drive it? Yeah, you've rented cars before. So yeah, you know how to drive it. Sure, things may be slightly different. The wheel is in the same spot. The turn signal may be on one side or the other. The windshield wiper may be in a different spot, but pretty much you know where everything, you know what all the tools are. You just have to find where they're at. This is the same thing as what you have with your camera. So let me share my screen just in case you. Did I show the right one? There we go. All right. So the mode dial. And you can see that, you can see my cursor moving around. That's an example of a mode dial. Auto mode, it doesn't do all the thinking. Yes, I know, auto mode. What's its purpose? It does the thinking for you. It's the camera smart mode. But what you learn as you learn more about photography is the camera's not very smart. You're way smarter than it. And once you learn how to use the tools, you probably are very unlikely to use the auto mode because it is the least creative mode available on a camera. You'd think it does the thinking, but the only thing that it does is control the amount of light. So in auto mode, you are still responsible for two things. Any guesses on what they are? And I can't see the
Take the lens cap off.
chat. That's kind of an important thing. Yeah. So in auto mode, you're still responsible for two things. Even though you are the camera is making the decisions for you, you are still responsible for two things. One, your composition. The composition. You have to move the camera around to get the composition that you want. And number two is when to press the shutter. So if you're photographing something that is in motion, a bird in your backyard, a hummingbird, you have to decide when to press it. It doesn't do that for you. There are some cameras that do that. If you're out on some property, you probably are familiar with a game camera. If you don't own property and you've never been on a ranch or something, you probably haven't heard of a game camera, but a game camera photographs, you put it on a post or a tree, and anything that passes by, motion sensor causes it to create the image. And so it's kind of one step beyond what you have with your camera. So those are the two modes, the two things that you're still responsible for, even when you're in full auto mode. Now, program mode, that's the P. By the way, if anyone has ever told you that P stood for professional, they were messing with you. P stands for program, and there are a total of 3 program modes. The camera is in charge of getting the exposure, the amount of light. And you're in control of 2 more things than you were when you were in auto mode. So if you were in auto mode, you just switch it over to the P, the program mode on your dial, and you can see those pictured there. Now, if you, let me do, and stop the share, and I can also show you with the camera that I have with me right here. So it's this dial right here, the mode dial, and I've got it currently in manual because, well, that's where I photograph, but I'm talking about program, and I started off talking about full auto, and then moving it over to program mode. Now this mode dial is pretty much the same on all cameras, but it is different on some of them. So that's the mode dial that I'm talking about, and we're moving over to program mode, the P for program. And I didn't need to switch. Okay. So if everyone's on program mode, then I want to share with you the things that are that's different about it. Let me share my screen and go back to the handout. So in the program mode, one, the on-camera flash. If you have a camera that has a built-in flash, it's going to pop up on its own if it feels it needs enough light. Now, all right, so I'm a creative, give me a little leeway. Your camera doesn't feel, your camera doesn't think, your camera doesn't do any of those things. But yeah, I say your camera feels like it needs more light, or it thinks it does. The camera's not doing that. It doesn't have the ability to do that, but okay. I'm a creative, that's what I say. So your camera feels like there's not enough light, so therefore it pops up the flash. Now, the more expensive the camera, the less likely it is to have a pop-up flash on it. And so the cameras that are 2,000 and less usually have a pop-up flash. Those that are 2,500 and more usually don't have a pop-up flash. And you may think, well, the more you spend, the more stuff they have on it, right? No, because the pop-up flash isn't very good, and so the pros don't want it. is of no value to them. And so the manufacturers just don't put them there. They're just not included. But if you're in an environment that needs more light and you're in program mode, you're pressing the shutter, that flash will pop up if you have that on your camera. The second thing that you're in control of, by the way, you can turn that off simply by putting it in the flash suppression mode. But number two, the ISO, this stands for International Standards Organization. Now that you know what it stands for, does that help you in any way with what it does? Nope.
Not much.
It doesn't do anything. International Standards Organization. Now, here is the better way to know it. It's the way that I teach it. The I stands for image sensor. You may think, well, that's 2 letters. Yes, but it's one thing inside your camera. You have inside your camera, if you remember film days, and by the way, I have to use that. When I use the word film, I've got to make sure that I know who it is that I'm talking to. I've got to know my audience, because I have spoken with a few 20-somethings and teenagers. When I talked about film, they're like, what? What's that? And I said, the stuff that collects on your shower door. Like, oh yeah. No, no. The stuff that old people used to use in their cameras instead of all the electronic stuff they use now. No, I don't say that either. But I do have to differentiate, because not everybody understands the concept of film. And so when we had film, we would have to change out the film if we wanted a different film speed. Mm-hmm. Now we have one image sensor inside our camera. We never change out the image sensor. I guess if it was broken, you would, but you don't change out the image sensor. So therefore, how do you get it to be sensitive to differing amounts of light? Well, there's an algorithm inside of it. Inside your camera, there's a computer inside your camera. That's one reason why they cost a lot. And so you've got this computer inside your camera, and its goal through the light meter is to get the correct amount of light. And so therefore, one way that it does it, we're going to talk about all 3 ways, but one way that it does it is through ISO. And my way of calling it is the image sensor's sensitivity option. Image sensor sensitivity option. And with the image sensor sensitivity option, you gain control over the amount, how the image sensor is receiving light coming into the camera. So on your cameras, if you've got them there in front of you, take a moment and find out what your range is. Most cameras have a button or a menu item for ISO. When you press it and hold it down, you usually can see it isolated on the screen so that you can change it. Now, some are touch screens, just so you just touch it. But then you rotate to the rotators on there's usually 2, sometimes it's just 1 on a camera. You rotate to the one that you want. Now, the lower the number, the less the sensitivity to light. So if you're in a bright lit environment outside, bright, beautiful, sunny day, you want to use those lower numbers, usually 100, 200. If you're in an overcast day, not a bright overcast day, a darker overcast day, then you're going to need to raise that number. And if you're indoors, you're very likely to have to raise that number. There's reasons, there's a lot of variables here. So I have to simplify that particular part in order to go through it, because I want to have the lowest number possible. And the reason is because the lower the number, the smaller the grain size, the dots that make up the photograph, the pixels, they're smaller with the lower numbers. And as you raise it to higher and higher and higher numbers, they get larger and larger. So effectively, you get lower and lower quality when you start raising it to the higher numbers. Now, with the new cameras, this is one area that technology has done tremendous amount of improvement on. You can't improve a shutter speed. You can't improve an aperture, but you can improve ISO because it is digital. It is software. So therefore, the researchers and the manufacturers have done so much in this category that you can go pretty high now on your ISOs and still wind up with a fantastic photograph. But if you get too high with those numbers, the highest numbers, those are kind of a have to situation. If you're in an environment that is very low light, then you may have to increase that ISO, but you don't want to do that. It's a sacrifice in order to get the light that you need. And light, as you know, an incredibly important variable in photography. When it comes to, just the definition of photography, photography means light drawing. Therefore, light's a pretty important variable in photography. We have to get the amount of light right. And your camera's meter, that's what its job is. But as you know, even in program mode or full auto mode, your camera does not get the correct exposure every single time. It does a lot, maybe 80% of the time, but it depends on what kind of things you photograph. You may photograph things that it never gets right, or that it almost always gets right. Outside, bright, beautiful, sunny day, it almost always does a good job with exposure. Indoors, maybe not. So you want to be able to control these variables, and that's what we're going through in the basics. So every tool in photography, in the photography toolbox, and when I say tools, I mean all the different things you have available to choose from. Your camera probably has about 100,000 different tools available, combinations of tools available. I mean, you see a whole bunch of buttons and menu items on your camera, but the total number of things on here is the combinations, not total number of tools, but the total number of combinations on a camera is over 100,000. And so therefore, you're not going to know all the different tools available on the camera. There are just too many. It's kind of like going into Home Depot or Lowe's. Are you going to know what every single tool does when you go? I don't. I walk past quite a few every time I go. So I go in and I get the tool that I need and I leave. Same thing with photography. You get the tool or combinations of tools that you need in order to do your job, and you kind of ignore the rest. And so therefore you can be a great photographer and know very few of the tools, at least the combinations of tools available on your camera.
You have one question there, Jim, from Marcy. She's asking generally if in sunlight with photographing art. Let me get into that. Just lost my chat button. Generally in sunlight, what is the lowest number for photographing art? I'm guessing she's talking.
Now, that's a good question. Yeah, now it differs based on the camera, make and model. Most cameras, their lowest number is 100. There are a handful that it's 200 and a handful that it goes lower than that. Now, sometimes the ones that are lower are derived through software, but that's fine. It doesn't cause any problems. On the high end, it causes problems. On the low end, it doesn't. But the lowest number native to the camera. So the camera's ISO, the native ISO, which generally is 100. And that means that is what the image sensor is. Everything else is software derived in order to get to that. And so I want, generally speaking, 100 when I'm outside on a bright, beautiful, sunny day. Now there's times that is too much light. It depends on what I'm trying to photograph. If I'm photographing a waterfall motion and I want to convey the motion, in order to convey the motion, show the motion, I have to have a longer period of time. Well, the longer period of time, the more light that's collected. And so I have a problem there because I will collect too much light. In that instance, I want to use a filter to reduce the amount of light that's coming in. But for the most part, you won't need that for photographing. It's quite possible you do need it. It depends on the surface also of the art you're photographing. If it's highly reflective, I want you to put a polarizing filter on it, on the front of your lens. So it depends. It's one of those things where I kind of have to be in front of the light of the subject in order to know.
Really quick, I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt anybody, but can you just give me a quick rundown of the polar? It's been so long, and I do have a polarizer on my camera, but if you could give me like a definition so that I can write it down and kind of, I guess remember it better.
Sure. A polarizing filter, every single tool in photography has an effect and a side effect. And so the effect of a polarizing filter is to reduce or improve or show the reflection. So it's either to reduce it or make it even better than it is. So if we're standing, if we're at, all right, so James and I are walking through La Cantera and on our way to our pedicures, because yeah, we do that. And on our way there, we passed by this display inside one of the businesses of shoes, and we have to come back for those shoes. We don't have time now because we need to make it to our appointment, but we see the shoes, and so we photographed these shoes through the window. And so what happens when you photograph it? It's brighter outside than it is inside, so therefore you get a good photograph of the reflection rather than the shoes. And so therefore, since I want the shoes that are inside there, I want to use a polarizing filter. Now, a polarizing filter, once you get it all the way onto the camera, and maybe I should change that view. Once you get a polarizing filter all the way onto a camera, it sits right here. It screws on. Now, there's other types that slide in also, but the kind that screws in, once you have it all the way on, it's got 2 rings on it. The first one, the closest one to the body, to the lens, you tighten it all the way. The other one never tightens because you don't want it to. You want to be able to turn it. And as you turn it, looking through the viewfinder, you're going to be able to see how the reflection changes, because it's kind of like horizontal blinds. Are you familiar with horizontal blinds? I have them in my windows here, but horizontal blinds kind of are like this. And as you turn them, they allow different direction of light to come in. And so therefore, that's effectively what's happening inside your camera. You're either allowing the reflected light to pass through, or you're allowing the direct light to pass through. So if I'm photographing those shoes, I want the direct light to pass through, and I want the reflected to go away. So my goal is to turn it until it looks good. There's no markings on the outside that determine that have numbers or anything on it. It'll say polarizing filter in the company name and the size, but there isn't anything on there because it doesn't need to. You just turn it until you like it. And if you're photographing a piece of artwork that has it's reflective, I want to get rid of that reflection because it takes away from my artwork. Unless my artwork needed that. Maybe I have mirrors, or maybe it's multi-medium where I've got things on it that are supposed to do that. Okay, so maybe that's the case. But for the most part, I'm using, if it has anything reflective that I don't want to show, I want to use that polarizing filter. Now, it also has a side effect, and that's to increase contrast. If I'm photographing clouds, just outside, bright, beautiful sunny day, if I'm photographing the clouds, the dark areas, the grayer areas get darker, and the brighter areas get brighter. Now, effectively, that's not how that's effectively how it's happening. That's actually not what is happening. But effectively, it's increasing the contrast. That is the side effect of a polarizing filter. Did that answer your question, Sierra?
Yes, it did. Thank you. And I do remember you going over this. Initially, I just kind of needed a reminder. So thank you.
Refresher.
I just got a new
Totally
one.
get it.
I was
Of
kind of
course.
like, wait, what does this thing do again?
Of course.
Thanks for bringing me up to speed. I got it. Thank you.
Jim, just kind of one last question on that topic with the polarizing filter is a lot of artists that might be photographing their paintings. How will a polarizing filter affect the color? And I don't want to get off too much of a tangent, but I think this is an important question to ask, because obviously, they can bring the image into Photoshop or other image, color correct, software which allows color correction, but how much color correction will need to be done after they photograph their artwork? And a lot of oil paintings, a lot of acrylic paintings will have like kind of reflective or semi-reflective varnish, so it may be wise to use a polarizing filter.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, it definitely needs, in many cases, it's going to need the polarizing filter. And polarizing filters generally have a blue tint to them. Okay. So does that mean always? Of course not. There's some that have kind of a smoke gray that don't really change. They're kind of neutral density polarizers, but most polarizers have a blue tint. And you've probably, those who have photographed artwork have probably realized the auto mode does an okay job, but your goal is to do the color rendition identical, not good enough. You want it to be, if you spent time making that color the exact color that you need for it to be for whatever reason, and your color is off when you photograph it, you're not going to be happy with that. You're not going to be satisfied with that. Those who have never done that probably don't understand it to that extent. So I don't do paintings, but I don't create paintings, but I have photographed them before. And I know that they are concerned with that. And those who do it themselves, I know you're concerned with that. And so, yes, that is a concern. If you're photographing in camera raw, so you've got JPEG and RAW for the most part on all cameras. If you're in RAW, it doesn't really matter what you're doing in camera, because that information is going to the extra stuff that you did won't even be there. If you turn it to black and white when you're in RAW, that color information will still be there. It doesn't actually delete it like it does in JPEG. JPEG actually deletes that stuff. And so I do recommend that you use RAW. Generally speaking, there are times when JPEG is the better option, but not usually. RAW is usually the better option. Now, RAW does mean more work. It means you're going to have to spend some time in Photoshop or some other photo manipulation program in order to get the colors the way you want them, which also throws another variable into it. Don't you love all these variables?
Mhm.
You have to do color calibration on your computer screen, and often. So don't skip out when you're purchasing. If getting color correct, which pretty important. If getting color correct is important to you, don't skimp when you purchase your monitor.
Yeah.
And then make sure that you also get a color correction device, something that goes on the surface of your monitor and checks it regularly. And there are some that are permanent. They check it. They're in constant check. Those will be a little bit more. There's some that you can check, maybe every once a week or once a month, however often you feel is appropriate. And you'll notice once it goes through the check, it changes it a little bit because your screen changes.
One of the things
It ages over time, and so therefore it needs.
One of the
What's
things
that?
we see with people that do have calibrated monitors or calibrate their monitors, and not just general calibration purposes, is their color accuracy on their prints are typically much better. And it's not easy to calibrate a monitor anymore like it used to be. It's a lot harder, and you do get what you pay for when it comes to monitors. The cheap monitor is very hard to calibrate, so you do have to invest a little bit if you want to be able to calibrate that monitor. So, but I don't want to get too far off of a tangent, but that information I think would be very helpful for our users.
Yeah, good. All right, so did that answer those questions?
So
Yes.
I guess so. All right, so back to the handout. We just finished the program mode. Now we're moving into another program mode because there's three. One's called program. The next one we're going to be talking about is the shutter priority or time value. It does have different names on different camera brands, but what we're talking about is the shutter speed. And I'm sure you all have heard of that particular tool. This is just a period of time that light hits the image sensor. And I like to take it into one further, and you can see right here, the summary of the period of time that light hits the image sensor or imaging plane. So that means either film or the digital image sensor. There are times when I want to convey motion. There are times when I want to stop motion. And these require differing amounts of time. If I'm trying to photograph a car that's driving by and it's on the highway, it's moving pretty quickly, so I need a faster shutter speed than if I am photographing someone who is standing in front of a classroom, because they're moving at different amounts of speed. Also, they're in differing amounts of light. So outside on a bright, beautiful sunny day, photographing a car versus photographing a person who's in an interior environment up in front of a classroom, I need different amounts of light. I need different shutter speeds. And so there's two reasons why I need to be thinking about the shutter. And that's no matter what, I have to get the correct amount of light. But every tool, like I said before, every single tool in photography has an effect and a side effect. The effect on ISO, shutter speed, and aperture are all the same. It's amount of light. Their effect is identical, amount of light. That's for all three, the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture. We haven't gotten to aperture yet, but that's next. The side effect on shutter speeds is the ability to convey or stop motion. So motion is its side effect.
I have a question. Sorry, here.
Does that mean somebody's taking notes? Sure.
So, when you choose shutter speed, you've chosen a fast shutter speed. Is the camera still making decisions around AV and ISO for you? I mean, it probably makes a decision about aperture based on the ISO, right? Or if you're, I don't know how that.
So to add to that,
Well,
I
you're
don't
heading
wanna-
in the right direction.
the recently I've been doing researches, I've been researching lenses, and different lenses have been able to, I don't know, they've had an impact on that from what I've been seeing in tutorials. So like what she's saying, is it like quite possible, right? With the different lens? Or am I like misinterpreting?
There are a lot of variables, that's for sure. Well, but there are a lot of variables, but generally speaking, which is what I have to do when I'm talking to people who I know have lots of different cameras, is answer those questions kind of generically, but generally. The answer is, when you're in shutter priority mode, now that's called time value if you have a Canon, but if you're in shutter priority mode, then you are choosing, and there's one reason and one reason only to ever choose shutter priority mode. It's not the right tool if you don't have this particular reason, and that's you want to control time. Now, what the heck does that mean, control time? See, this is kind of a weird thing, because this isn't something that a human really understands, because we understand time as being a linear thing. It just keeps on going and going and going, like the Energizer Bunny keeps on going and going and going. But it isn't as simple as we understand it. We have a shutter speed, by the way. A human shutter speed is 1/24th of a second, approximately. So our shutter speed, 1/24th of a second, that is how we view life. We think that is the norm because it is for us. But nothing else is confined by our definition of time. That's just a human definition of time. That's all it is. And so when we have our camera in shutter priority, the only reason we ever do that is because we want to control the amount of time, what happens during that period of time that the shutter is open collecting light. So if we want to stop the motion of something, then we need probably to have a faster shutter speed. I say probably. What if you're photographing a snail that has motion, but not compared to a race car? But our goal is the same. My goal is to X, whatever it is. I want to convey the motion of that waterfall. Don't you love the photographs of the waterfall where the water is so soft and flowy that it looks more like, I don't know, cotton or tulle than it does like water? Oh, it's beautiful. It's the it's the images that you see in those in calendars and motivational posters and that kind of thing. So they look really cool. So if you want to control the time, the period of time that light is hitting the image sensor, this is the only time when you use the shutter priority mode. If you're not thinking time, then you're not using this tool. You don't pull it out of the photography toolbox. Now, what does it affect? You are choosing the time. So 1/60th of a second, 1/500th of a second, 1 second. You're choosing the amount of time. Your camera is choosing the aperture for you. And the aperture is just the hole that lets light in. We'll be talking about that one in a little bit more detail in a little bit, but it's just a hole that lets light in. And so, and it comes in different sizes to allow more or less light in. Same, like I said before, ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, their effect is the same, amount of light. So somehow they control an amount of light. ISO does it through the sensitivity. Shutter does it through time, and aperture does it through the size of the opening. But each one, their effect is amount of light. Now, there are 3 variables. So when you put your camera in shutter priority, you're choosing the shutter speed. The camera is choosing the aperture, and you are choosing the ISO. In all 3 program modes, you are in control of ISO. So the camera's only choosing one variable for you, and that's the aperture. Falu, does that answer your question?
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Sure, you're welcome. And Sierra, did that answer yours?
Yes, thank you.
Cool. All right, so to talk about shutter speeds even further, if I have a favorite tool, it is shutter speeds. And the reason is because we can do things with shutter that you cannot do or even comprehend and understand as a human. Because we're in control of time with a shutter speed, we're in control of something that a human has zero control over: time. We don't have control over time. I mean, aren't there times when you'd like for things to move a little faster? In line at a grocery store? Aren't there times when you want to have things last a little longer? Watching the sunset go down with a friend or family member and drinking your favorite beverage. You'd like for that to last a little longer. So we'd like to be able to control time. We don't have control over time, but you have a tool with a camera that can. It doesn't have the limitations that a human has. With a camera, we can control time. I can purposefully allow something to happen during that period of time. For instance, if I want to photograph a highway at night where people have their lights on, so the white lights and the red lights, you've seen this photograph before, where there's red streaks and white streaks on a highway, and you think in your mind cars. But analyze that photograph for a second. There's no cars. You can't see a single one. If one's broken down on the highway, then maybe you see that one, but you don't see the cars. Why do you not see the cars? Because cars are moving during that period of time. They're not in any one space long enough to collect enough light. So that brings me to something that you might have never thought about before. In fact, I would bet that you haven't. Humans are invisible. Let that sink in for just a moment before I explain why. Humans are invisible. There is nothing about us that is visible. We require a third party in order for us to be seen by another human, and that is light. Without it, we're invisible. And you know this already. You just haven't thought about that before. In other words, I can photograph people, and if they're in motion, if I choose a long enough shutter speed, I can make them disappear. If I want to photograph the Alamo in the afternoon, in the morning, when people are walking by, if I choose about a 7, 8, 10 second, let's say 8-second long exposure, anyone who's in motion will not be in any one spot long enough to collect enough light. Now, the building is still that entire time, so it looks normal, but the people who are walking by will not show up. So it reminds me of a story. Several years ago, if you guys have been to the AT&T Center where the San Antonio Spurs play, they used to have many kiosks that as you walked into your seats, they would sell singular items. Like they'd sell beer, they'd sell nachos, they would sell pretzels, cotton candy, I don't know, all this different stuff. They would sell a single thing just to catch you as you walked into your seats. And on the side of every single one of those was a photograph of the Alamo at a time of day when there should have been people, but there were no people in that photograph. And I know because I'm the one that created that photograph. I don't know if they're still up anymore because it's been so long since I've watched the Spurs game, but there were there were 60 of them throughout the entire AT&T Center, but you see no people in the photograph, even though there were. It's because I chose a shutter speed long enough where as they were walking, they were in motion. So therefore not enough light collected. Now you may think, well, I see that every day. If I were to go there, I'd see people walking by. Yes, but you can only see at one shutter speed. You are limited to 1/24th of a second. You have no ability to experience life in any other way, except through a camera. With a long exposure, about 10 seconds, 8 seconds, you can make them go away. Now, if someone's sitting down in a bench checking their deleting emails or something, they've got a newspaper or whatever, yeah, you're going to see them because they're still. That security guard who's standing over on the side, you're going to see him because he's still. But anyone who's in motion, they're not in any one spot long enough to collect the amount of light. I am in control of shutter speed. I'm in control of time with a camera. So therefore, I can create images that cannot be seen by a human. How do you feel about that?
Superpowers.
That's right.
Yeah, I've practiced that and had a lot of fun with that.
It is fun. Man, there are so many things I could talk about shutter speed. And maybe I'll tell one more story, but then I want to move on to the other things because there's a bunch more stuff I want to cover. But shutter speeds I get so excited about because you can't do this as a human. I'm going to tell you a story, and shutter speed is the tie-in. But every year before my boys went to college, one of them has already moved out, and the other one is in his senior year in college, and so we may be empty nesters in no time. But every year before we went to before college started, every year we went on the Landers Men trip. And yeah, that means Robin didn't go. Now you may be thinking that we excluded Robin. Robin excluded Robin. Robin went on the first trip, and it wasn't called Landers Men trip the first time. It was only called that the second and subsequent times. Robin went the first time and didn't remember camping the same way she remembered it as a kid. And so she didn't have quite as much fun, I think, as she did when she was a kid, and said, you know what? I'm not planning on going on any more of those trips. You guys can go yourself. It could be the Landers Men trip. So she doesn't call it the Landers Men trip, though. She calls it the testosterone-free weekend.
Peace and quiet.
But yeah, exactly. So she stopped going, but we kept that tradition going, and we went to several different places. Now I'm going to tell you a story about one of them. This one particular Landers Men trip, we decided to go to Lake Buchanan, which is about 2 hours north of here on 281 near Burnett, Texas. And this particular lake, when we went, with state parks, you can reserve your space, your camping spot online. And so we reserved our space, and we were only about 3 weeks out, and we were kind of surprised that we got the spot that we wanted, because we thought it was just like a perfect spot right on the water, and it was just amazing. So when we get there and get to the spot that we're at, we're thinking, this doesn't look like the picture, because there wasn't any water. We didn't see any water in the spot that we were at. What we realized in pretty short period of time is there hadn't been rain in a long time. So the lake was actually pretty much dry. Off in the distance, I could see a little bit of mud, but no, it was pretty dry. And so we got to do something that you may never get a chance to do, walk on a lake bed. That was kind of fun. But at night, we got there on a night that was a new moon. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with what that means. I think it should be called no moon, because new moon is no light at all. The moon's not visible. So therefore, it was very dark out there. We did see some lights across the lake bed, but on our side, there was us and one other family. I guess another family that didn't get the memo like we did. And we went there with my brother and his son. And we set up our campsite there. And at night, we only, you'd think we have the campfire, right? Well, burn ban. If there's no rain, then there's a burn ban. And so therefore we couldn't have a campfire. So what are the reasons you go to the lake for a camping trip? The water, the campfire. Oh man. So what do we do when the sun goes down? Well, if you're a photographer, pull out your camera. But you may be thinking, Jim, you just said a little while ago, the photography means light drawing. Therefore you have to have light in order for you to work this thing. It's a light collection device. Yep. Cell phone, flashlight, there's other sources of light. We did light painting. I put the camera on the picnic table because I forgot my tripod. Tripod would have been the better tool. I put my camera on the picnic table and I said, all right, Ryan, you go first. I'm going to set my camera on 15 seconds. And I want you to just write something with your cell phone. And so I'm going to show you what he wrote, and I want to ask if you know what he wrote. So I'm going to say this is cell phone. I'm going to back up a little bit so I have a little more space. There we go. This is cell phone off. This is cell phone on. Cell phone on, cell phone off. And he wrote something in the air. And let's see if you can understand what it was that he wrote. What did he write?
No idea.
Let's do it one more time. All right. So he wrote,
Hi.
what did he write?
Hi.
Hi, but what did he write? You're right. He wrote hi. And so I'm thinking this is pretty darn cool because what I realize is he has to write it to the camera. In other words, he has to write it backwards. He has to write it backwards. And I didn't tell him he had to write it backwards. And so he was probably in, I don't know, 6th, 7th, 8th grade. He's probably middle school. And so what does dad say when he realizes he did something, my son did something and I didn't even tell him? I'm thinking, yes, yes, I'm happy about that. And so my other son, Ricky, gets up and he writes his name in cursive backwards. He wasn't going to get beat by hi. So I'm thinking 2 smart ones. Yes. And we played with that for, I don't know, a couple of hours. We did lots of different things. We did light painting by painting the tent, by painting the trees, by painting, just had fun with it throughout the night. So things you can do with shutter speeds that you might not have ever thought about before. If you have any other questions about shutter speeds, I'll answer those. But otherwise, I'm going to move over to aperture. So aperture priority. And this is called aperture value if you've got Canon, but for the most part, it's aperture. Now, aperture is just a hole that lets light in. I don't want you guys to go any further into or be misled or misunderstand. An aperture is simply a hole that lets light in. That is all an aperture is. If there was a hole in my roof, that would be an aperture. I'm glad there's not. But if any hole that lets light in, it's an aperture. Eyes, aperture. Any hole that lets light in is an aperture. Now, there's a unit of measurement to say how much or how big is that hole. And that unit of measurement is called an f-stop. They're absolutely positively not the same thing. But as far as socially speaking, if someone says, what aperture did you use? Don't give them that look of, what? It was the hole that let light in? They're actually meaning what f-stop did you use? And F stands for focal stop. Not that changes anything or makes you a better photographer, but if you were curious what the F and f-stop stood for, focal, F-O-C-A-L, focal stop. Now, you can probably see right here on my screen, f22 all the way down to f1.4. There are f-stops that are smaller than the f22. There are f-stops that are larger than f1.4, but that's the ones that you see here. And you might think, well, that seems kind of backwards. Shouldn't a larger number mean a larger opening? Yeah, on the surface, it kind of seems that way, but it's not how it is. And the reason is because these are fractions. So let's take two of these, f4 and f8. And let's give an illustration of why an f4 is bigger opening than an f8 is. Now, you can see that it is, but if you weren't looking at this, you wouldn't know it unless you already knew it. And so let's say that there was 4 of us, just 4. And there was $1 million. And we got to split that $1 million. 8's a bigger number, right? Let's go get 4 more people. Oh, but what happens to your $1 million? Your split of that $1 million, it gets smaller as a result. So what we're talking about here is a fraction. I know you don't want to get into math. Most of us creatives, we'll stay away from math as long as we have to. But this is math. F4 is a larger opening than F8 because we're talking about fractions. We're talking about a smaller and smaller amount of light because we're dividing it up. We're using less and less space. By the way, you can't use a full amount of space because you have things inside your lens holding it all together. So you've got things that hold it. You've got things that zoom that could be on a track of some sort that move it back and forth. These things take up space, and so therefore there's lots of reasons why some lenses don't get a lot of light in, and others get more. And you'll notice that the lower the number of the f-stop, the lower that number is, the greater the cost. There's of course a difference between zoom lenses and prime lenses, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. So if your goal is to get something in focus and something out of focus, there have to be a couple of variables that are in place. One is there must be a difference in distance. Either it's closer or it's further away. That part doesn't matter, but it has to be a difference in distance. If things are the exact same distance, there's nothing you can do to get one in focus and the other out of focus. You've seen this before. You maybe even have used the word bokeh or bokeh. Both just mean the background is so out of focus that you see circles of confusion. And that's what you're seeing here. What you see is the shape of the light coming through the lens. That's why it looks kind of round. The shape is kind of round. And that's the shape of the light coming through the lens. If you were to put something in front of your lens that was, say, the shape of a Christmas tree, then that light would be the shape of a Christmas tree, because bokeh is just the shape of the light coming through the lens. That's all it is. Did you guys know that one? I bet some of you did. All right, in order to maximize a small depth of focus. Now it's called depth of field. If we're going to use the correct terminology, it's called depth of field. But a lot of us will use depth of focus because it makes a little bit more sense. Where you can have something that's let's say I'm photographing, the camera's on this side, and I'm photographing things that are over here on this side. And so I've got something that's relatively close, something that's further away. I can choose to focus on that closest thing and get the last one out of focus. If I want that, if my goal is to maximize the depth of focus, making one thing in focus and the other thing's out of focus, then I have to use a small f-stop number. Small depth of focus, small f-stop number. So it's pretty easy to remember. One more time. If I want a small depth of focus, I choose on purpose a small number for my f-stop. Now, there's one reason and one reason only that you should ever use this particular tool. Kind of like there was one reason only for the shutter speeds. There's only one reason to use the aperture priority, and that's if you're thinking depth of focus, whether you're talking about a shallow depth of focus or you're talking about a large depth of focus. For instance, if we were photographing, let's go back to the Alamo in our minds. It's something that I think that most of us can picture. If we're photographing our family standing in the road that's in front of the Alamo, so the whole building shows in the background, then we want to choose a larger numbered f-stop so that we can get everything in focus, the entire distance in focus. Because if we were to focus on just them, and we were close to them, let's say, and we chose a real small numbered f-stop, that background could go so far out of focus that you wouldn't even tell that was the Alamo in the background. So there are times when you purposefully are wanting to choose the f-stop so that you can choose the depth of the focus. And that's when you choose aperture priority.
So Jim, just I want to kind of bring something to everyone's attention in regards to that. People that are photographing their artwork, and going back to that topic or that aspect of this topic, is one of the things we've seen is people have used the wrong f-stop for photographing their artwork. So what happens is you get a vignette sort of effect where the focus, it's nice, the artwork, the photograph of the painting is nice and crisp and sharp in the center, whereas as you move away from the center, it starts to become less sharp, more softer. Now, would that be am I correct in assuming that would be attributed to what you've just described?
It absolutely could be. Yeah. Is it necessarily, there are other variables that could cause that. It could be the lens itself that's causing this particular problem. But yeah, that could absolutely happen because we're talking about distance. And so if we're relatively close to our subject, but our subject is wide, then the distance we are here is different than the distance we are here.
Mhm.
So therefore, we want to do a couple of things, really. We want to get further away from our subject, therefore making every distance pretty much the same thing. That way it becomes a non-variable. We also want to use a pretty high quality lens. Can you get away with low quality lenses? Yeah. You want to, I don't even want to talk about that because there are ways around it, but workarounds are inconsistent. So we want to choose a camera with a good quality lens on it. We want a little bit of distance. And I say a little bit, when you're photographing down on something, because sometimes artwork is photographed down on, sometimes it's photographed straight in front of you. And it depends on where the light is coming from. So as to which one of those I'm going to choose, and the subject itself. I mean, if it's an extremely heavy piece, I probably am very unlikely to try and hang it on a flat surface. I have photographed things on my fence in the backyard before, but usually I just set it down. And again, there's different reasons why I would do different things. So there's not a blanket statement here. There's nothing that can really generalize easily on, but it's either down or it's straight in front of me. And I'm probably going to choose most of the time a mid-range f-stop when I'm photographing art. Usually it's flat, but there, you could, maybe you've got a bas relief that has some depth to it that you're photographing, or maybe you're photographing a sculpture. So therefore, I want to choose a slightly, I might go with an f-stop number that's a little bit larger. So maybe f8, f11, f16. If it's a sculpture, I'm probably going to want to go the f16. If it's flat, if it's art on canvas, and it may have some texture because of the texture of the medium, but for the most part, it's relatively flat, then I don't need those higher numbers. I need lower numbers for that. But any f-stop number is going to be just fine when it's totally flat and equal distance from the camera.
Gotcha. Okay, thanks. Appreciate it.
Is that where you were heading with that?
Yeah. I think it will help people image files, that will help them with the image files they submit. A lot of people aren't conscientious of that. They and so they don't really inspect the files. And so I would recommend everyone inspect their files very closely, zoom in on them, because if you're zoomed in away from them, you're not going to be able to see how well in focus every aspect of that painting is. And I'm referring to photographing paintings in this case versus sculptures.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Now, every lens is going to have a different range. Now, they may be very similar, and some have exactly the same range of f-stops, but your lens is in control of your f-stop. Even though most modern cameras, you control the f-stop on the body of the camera, the change actually happens in the lens on most cameras, not all, but on most cameras, the change happens in the lens. And on older cameras, you actually are changing something that is on the lens, the lens itself. The f-stop would have been changed on the lens. So that's not something that most of us work with today. And so we kind of feel like that's part of the camera. It isn't. It's part of the lens. And so get a different lens, get a different range of f-stops. The higher quality lenses will have a greater range. And there's, of course, a difference between prime lenses, meaning there is no change in focal length. If you want to get a different distance, you physically move the camera yourself. If you have a zoom lens, then by turning the lens, you get closer or further away. Now, I think everybody has an understanding of what a zoom lens is. It just means that that you have a variable focal length. And the focal length is described as the distance between the optical center and let me show you that because I have that in this handout. Share that. The distance between the optical center and the imaging plane or focal plane. That is what the focal length is. If it's a prime lens, then this doesn't move. If it's a zoom lens, then this moves backwards and forwards when you're photographing whatever. And I just put a triangle shape. But light travels in a straight line. So it goes through the optical center and over. Now, where's the optical center on the lens? It's usually in the back part of the lens. It's sometimes within the body of the camera, but it's just where the light crosses, And in order to have, if you've had the focal plane and the optical center in the same spot, you would have a singular point of light. And that's what you do if you have a magnifying glass and you want to burn a hole in a leaf. It's the optical center. That's where all the light converges, where it crosses. If you lift it up or lift it down, it will not burn. You've done that before with a magnifying glass, right? Maybe a few years ago when you were a kid, but you've probably all done that. When you back it up, you can actually see the sun on the ground, because what you have then is an imaging focal plane. You can see it. Now it's going to be so bright you can't really see it well, but that's what happens there. But the distance between optical center and the imaging plane is focal length. If it's variable, you have the ability to move it, then that's a zoom lens. If you have a fixed optical center, if it doesn't have the ability to zoom in, zoom out, it's a prime lens. Now the advantage with a prime lens is there's less stuff inside there, so therefore you're using more of the glass, therefore you get more light, and you're not paying extra for it. When you have a zoom lens, when you spend extra money on something, you get to have more light come into the camera, but the difference in cost can be ridiculous. Now, a lot of cameras come with a kit lens, like an 18 to 55. And so many of you probably have the 18 to 55. It's not a bad lens. It's a good lens. And if you were to get its upgraded version, it's a 17 to 55. And that 18 to 17 is not the difference in the price. The difference is the f-stop. With an 18 to 55, you have a range between f3.5 and f5.6. And the reason there's a range is because you have a range in focal lengths, 18 to 55 millimeters. But when you spend the extra money and buy the upgraded version, then it's 2.8 throughout, no matter what focal length you're at. And so that's what you're paying for, is by your ability to have that same f-stop throughout all of the focal lengths.
Jim, you have a question off of YouTube. David is asking, so if you photograph from further away, does it make a big difference, telephoto versus wide angle? Doesn't wide angle make for better depth of field?
See, better depth of field is kind of like beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Some people want that and some people don't want that. So they wouldn't consider it better. But based on what he's saying, you said David?
Yes,
Is that right?
That's David.
Based on what David is saying, then yeah, it probably is better. But for the most part, the problem with using a wide angle lens is the potential for distortion. And our goal when photographing most things is to keep it the way that it actually is. Mm-hmm. So therefore, I want actually something that's a 50 millimeter to 100 millimeter. And I think maybe 70 is really ideal. 85 is good. Up to maybe 135, but somewhere between 50 and 135 is where I want to photograph artwork, if I'm photographing art. And I don't want to use a wide angle lens unless I have to. Mm-hmm. No.
I think some artists, that's
again,
what they
beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah, they may gravitate to, I think artists may gravitate to the wide lens, thinking they're going to capture more of, like when you have a 4 foot by 5 foot canvas, for instance, and they're thinking, well, I probably need to get a wide lens so I can stand 3 feet away.
For convenience purposes, that's exactly right. But for maximizing the artwork and making it look as ideal and perfect as it is, I want to be able to pull away and use a telephoto lens.
Yeah, that's one of the things we'll see. We can tell when a person's using a wide angle lens. Is they'll be kind of bowed on the sides, whereas when they're photographing the artwork from further away, they tend to be more straight, more angular.
Yeah. Yep, that's right. Yeah, and 50 millimeters is considered normal. And normal is just what you see, not including your peripheral vision. Now, we all have peripheral vision for the most part. I think over time you may lose a little bit of it, but peripheral is just the stuff that's on the side. You can't read anything. Like if I've got a piece of paper over here, I can't read the text that's on it. I might be able to tell that there is text, and if there's motion, that's really what its purpose is be able to see that there's something moving over here. But in order to read something, I really need to have it in front of me in order to see it well. And so 50 millimeters is what I see, what a human sees, and it's somewhere between 50 and 55 is what all of us are normal. And so that's why a lot of the kit lenses are 18 to 55, so it's a wide angle to normal. That's what that is. So your normal field of view, not including peripheral, because what you see includes peripheral. So you don't really see this. It's just kind of a rectangle right here in front of you. And the reason it's a rectangle is because you've got two eyes, but it's kind of a rectangle right here in front of you, and everything else, it's there. You can see it in your field of view, but it's not part of your normal field of view. It's not part of the area that you can read and see very clearly in. So that part is called normal. Anything that is greater than that, we call it periphery, but in camera terms, we call it wide angle. This is what we call it, wide angle. And then anything that's coming in from that is just flat, really. When we're photographing, a lot of times when we're photographing, so if we're photographing art, we're taking something that could possibly be flat, and it's photographed flat. But if we're photographing something that isn't flat, maybe we're photographing a landscape, and it's got a lot of distance. It's got a field, it's got trees, it's got mountains in the background and clouds behind that. So we've got massive amount of difference there, or distance. We're taking something that is three-dimensional and turning it into something that is just two. So therefore, we want to show that off. We want to be able to tell that there's some distance. And it's one reason why a lot of photographers like to photograph in the early morning or in the late evening if they're photographing landscapes, if they're photographing people, because the lighting is softer, but it's also better about telling distance. When I'm photographing something that's totally flat, a wall, a painting, if I'm photographing something totally flat, then I don't really care so much about that. It's not a variable that I am concerned with. It's a tool in the photographer's toolbox, but it's not one that I'm pulling out at that moment. But I still don't want to have the potential for anything. I mean, if you've got an aspherical lens, aspherical lens, then it does help with that bending of wide angle lenses. It makes it a little bit more flat, but I'd still rather use a telephoto, at least a normal, but a telephoto lens. And a normal is 50 millimeters approximately. A telephoto is anything greater than that. So let's say 60 and up, that's telephoto. When I have something that's real long, the larger numbers, I have to get so far away from the art that it's rather annoying. And I might not be able to get far enough away from it. And so photographing art, I don't want a 200 millimeter lens. It's just too far away, unless it's big art. Let's say it's a mural on the side of a two-story building. Maybe I do want it for that, but I likely am not able to get far enough away from it to make that happen. And so if I'm forced to use a wide angle lens, and that's what I use. But if I'm not forced to use a wide angle, I'm not going to use a wide angle.
I think that's very helpful, very helpful. These are questions that are posed to us quite often, so I think people will the fact that it was brought up by David, I think will help a lot of people.
Yeah, he's a geogallery artist there. So I know he's worked really hard, and he has caught very good captures of his art.
Nice.
Yeah, it is really nice. And just to let you know, we're about 7:48. So we sometimes go over, but I just wanted to let you know kind of where you're at right now.
Thank you.
Jim,
there's maybe a couple more things I'd like to go over.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure you'd be able to catch everything.
One thing that I think that I've come across a lot of times as being a problem is the focusing system. Where sometimes our photographs come out slightly soft. And this is a serious problem for a lot of photographers. Now, for those who like a soft look, a romantic look, maybe that soft is fine. But for most of us, we like to have a sharp image. Sometimes they come out too sharp. I've seen that as well. But for most of us, we want a relatively sharp image, at least so that we can have the choice of being able to soften it later if we wanted to have that romantic, soft look to it. But for the most part, we really care about having a sharp image. So therefore, the focusing system is an incredibly important variable. And let me show that. Let me share that part of my screen. And this is on the handout if you have it. Share that, the focusing system. If there is no contrast, there's not going to be any focus. And you've probably had this before where you're pressing the shutter on the camera and the lens just goes and it just simply does not focus. If your focusing point is on something that has no contrast in it, it can't. If I'm photographing a blue sky, no clouds, there's nothing for it to focus on. So therefore it can't. If I'm photographing a flat door, no detail in it at all, just painted white, painted whatever, it won't focus on it. It'll do that. So I have to have contrast in order for there to be focus. Make sure that when you look through the viewfinder that you're focusing on your subject using the boxes or dots that are in your view and your viewfinder. Your camera focuses by detecting contrast on those focus points, and you've got the ability to change the focus points. A lot of times we use the full auto on our. By the way, there's 2 auto systems for your focus. There's a total of 5 auto systems on most cameras, but 2 of them are dedicated to focus. One is auto point of focus, where it chooses the point of focus for you, and the other is just auto focus, where it's moving the elements of the lens to sharpen the photograph, to sharpen the subject you're photographing. And so you see there are 3 focusing system modes where you have autofocus. The camera focuses on whatever that has contrast that you have the focus box or dot on. The second is auto point of focus, where the camera chooses for you what's in focus. I can't stand that. But there are times when it's appropriate. If I'm photographing something where I can't put the viewfinder up to my eye, well, then that might be appropriate to leave it there. But for the most part, I turn that off, even though that's a default. Most cameras have auto point of focus as a default. So you have to turn it off. And then the third is manual focus, where you focus yourself. And please don't confuse manual focus with manual mode. There's no correlation whatsoever there. Manual mode does not mean you have to use manual focus. When I'm using manual focus, it means I am focusing, but I like to have autofocus where I choose the point of focus and the camera does the focusing for me.
So it sounds like a lot of people's like iPhones or Galaxy phone, their smartphones, that they got incredible cameras on them now. But one of the things I've noticed is whenever I take pictures of people like my daughter or my family, I mean, those square boxes are always pop, 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 pop. It sounds like it's always on some sort of auto point of focus. Is that basically what's happening with these cameras?
Yeah. You're going to choose the one that's best for what you're doing. It's just tools that are at the Home Depot and Lowe's. You get the tools that you need in order to do the job you want. And so for the most part, for what I photograph, and I don't photograph art very often. I don't photograph food very often. I photograph families and individual portraits mostly. And there's not a lot of motion in doing that. But with sports, there's a lot of motion. With landscape, there's the potential for it if you're photographing a waterfall. But I'm normally photographing a scene that I have set up myself. I've chosen the background, I've chosen the lighting, I've chosen the posing, I've chosen head tilts. I've had a role in the choosing of every variable. And so I also want to choose my focus point. If I have people at different distances, I want to focus on the closest. If I'm photographing things, and let me stop that share and share a different screen. And this goes along the lines of the aperture and f-stop we talked about before. Let's just bring up one of these images. How about that one? Stop that share and share this new screen. All right, so this should be a photo. Once it comes up, there we go. Photograph of a camera. There's actually two cameras behind it, but I have chosen to focus on this, the EX of Exacta. And you can see by the time it gets to the AKTA, it's already going out of focus. And as it gets closer over here on this side, it's already going out of focus. The lens is out of focus, even though it's closer. So I've got a very shallow depth of focus here. So do you believe that was caused by, created with a small numbered f-stop or a large numbered f-stop? Let you think about it for a second, and then I'll answer for you. It's a small number, small depth, small number. Now, what if I focus on the camera that's in the back? I still have a small depth of focus. So the f-stop did not change between these. What changed between them? The focus point. I moved the focus point from right here to right back here. Do you see the difference between those two? All I did was move my focus point. The f-stop remains the same. Stop that share. So I don't know if that actually answers your question or not, James, but it's how I interpret it. I want control over my focus point because I'm in control of my depth of focus. So therefore, I don't want my camera to choose the point of focus for me. I'm turning the auto point of focus off. And I have to be responsible for it at that point, meaning every single time I've got to move that little point. And let's go back to that, share my screen again and bring up my handout. I have to control which point it's on. And so in that first photograph, I chose one that was on this side, probably this top one. In the second photograph, I probably chose this one over here. Do you see it? Do you understand what I'm telling you?
Yeah. So I guess
I'm choosing that point of focus.
So this is a feature that just kind of expand on this that you don't readily see in your point and shoot cameras, but you find more in your digital SLR cameras, and you don't really see this on your iPhone camera. It's a lot of these point and shoot and phone cameras have this kind of built in, I think, possibly with like the auto point of focus mode versus a manual focus, or I guess you can turn on a manual focus, but I think a lot of them default to an auto point of focus. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, they absolutely do default to the auto point of focus and autofocus. With a cell phone, a lot of them you have touch point of focus, where you can touch the thing that you want to focus. So if there are several things, you can tell it, this is the thing that I want to focus. And as long as the subject or your camera don't move, then it's good. If it moves a little bit, it usually has a tracking feature, but if it's too much motion, it's not quick enough. There are cameras that are very quick about tracking, and those are made for sports. The one I use things that are very much for portraits, so I have no need for quick tracking. I don't use tracking at all. But even a lot of our cameras have tracking on them.
How much of focus is also dependent upon the quality of the lens? I mean, you mentioned the kit lenses. You get some decent pictures with those, but with photography, and I think this would, I kind of know the answer, but I think other people might want to know this, is how much, is the quality, do you get what you pay for when it comes to the lens being able to really capture crisp, sharp images?
Yeah. So the kit lenses that come with cameras are often good, but then there's better and best. And it really depends on what am I trying to accomplish with this tool. so many different tools available. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. When you go to Home Depot and Lowe's, there's a lot of tools in there, and there's some that you know exactly what they are and what they do, and there's some tools you really don't know that you'll never ever use in your entire lifetime. Same thing with photography. There's just as many tools available to you as a photographer as there are at the tool store. There's no difference. There might be more available to you, but your goal is to choose the ones that do the best job. Now, how do you know when you need to choose a different tool? The only way you really know is by someone's told you something and you research it, or you're not getting the results that you want. And that's the number one. When you are photographing something and every time it just seems to not be sharp. So therefore, it may be the user not using it correctly, or the tool, it's just not made for that. For instance, if I wanted to hammer a nail in the wall to put a photograph up, I could use a screwdriver. I could turn it around and use the backside and hammer that nail into the wall. I could use it for that. But that's not the tool that was made for that. The hammer was made for that. And there's different size hammers. There's really big, heavy ones. There's sledgehammers. So not all hammers are even the right tool for putting the nail into the wall. We have to choose the right tool. And so and we have to use it correctly too. This is another thing when it comes to flash. I think it's hilarious when someone says, it's hilarious and sad. But when someone says, I am a natural light photographer, and you ask them why, and they say, well, because flash is harsh and unnatural, and I don't want my photographs to look harsh and unnatural. Well, nobody does. It'd be the same as a carpenter saying, I don't use hammers because hammers can go through sheetrock. Yeah, if you use it wrong, it'll go through sheetrock. Sure, of course. The tool isn't the problem. The human is. Most of the time, if we think some problem is coming from the outside, oh man, if you would stop and look at yourself, you'll realize, if I make a change, then I don't experience this problem anymore. The flash is almost never the problem. It's the user of the flash. Almost always, that's the problem. It's the same way with every single tool.
Yeah, with that, Jim, is there, I guess, again, from an artist's perspective who wants to shoot their art, is there a camera body and a lens that you recommend to shoot large size paintings that would, on the camera body that catches good color, and the lens that doesn't give too much distortion? They're able to maybe do these within the studio and capture their art without really any distortion on the sides.
And I want a lens that's greater than 50. I could use, I am likely to use a prime lens for that kind of thing. It depends on the size and the consistency and how many I'm photographing. But if I am consistently photographing, say, a 4-foot wide painting or a 5-foot wide painting, I probably want an 85 millimeter lens, 1.4, although I probably won't ever need that, but probably just an 85 millimeter 1.4. You can get those for $500, sometimes more, but about $500. And that's the lens I want to use. I want to use for that. Now, anything, if you have lenses already, anything between 60 and 105, maybe 135, but I'm thinking 105. This is perfect. This is ideal for that. But I do want a newer lens, and I also want the lenses with coatings on them. If it's a Nikon, then I want the nano crystal coating. This N, do you see that N on my camera? Mm-hmm. It's a nano crystal coating, and that means that it has certain coatings on the surface of the lens that help me with certain things. It helps with well, there's several different coatings that are on these types of lenses, but it helps with reflected light. It helps with scratching. That's not necessarily camera quality, but it makes it work. When you clean the lens, it is less likely to scratch. By the way, if you've got light flares, it's probably a scratch on your lens or the filter that you have on a lens. I've come across people that say that you should never buy certain filters, and one of them was the UV filter. And I would say a UV filter is a good tool. Now, when you look through a UV filter, you don't see anything. It just looks like glass. But the advantage to the UV, and by the way, don't go cheap. If you see the UV filter for $30, don't buy it. If it's not made of glass and metal, just don't go there. The ideal is probably going to be 55 to 100 for this. And what it does for me, I call it the insurance filter. For photographing most things, it has no effect on it whatsoever. UV filter means ultraviolet. It's getting rid of, now we can't see ultraviolet light, and so it's not getting rid of ultraviolet light. It's getting rid of the effect on humidity. And so if we see this in the morning, when we see hill after hill after hill, if you live in the hill country, hill after hill after hill, the further away you go, the more kind of a blue-gray they become and they lose detail. But it's because of that accumulation of humidity. But that blue tint that it has, that's the effect of UV on humidity, and it will reduce that. But when you're photographing something relatively close, your artwork, UV filter doesn't help for the purpose that it has. It helps, though, in its side effect. And that side effect is you're going to keep your lens clean, period. You're going to touch it by accident. It's going to collect dust by accident. You're going to have to keep it clean. And so therefore, when you clean it, if there happens to be a slight bit of dust it's got grain in it, and you happen to wipe that, you now have that scratched into the lens. And I would not want it on my lens. I want that on my UV filter. That way, when I realize it, I can take that UV filter off and I can continue photographing and buy another one and put it on when I get a chance. But I don't want to risk the expensive lens. But again, I don't want to put a piece of cheap glass in front of my expensive lens. But I do want to use a UV filter.
Good tip.
So as far as today, I think we should come to a stopping point because I know we're going a little long. But we've covered the majority of the stuff that I had on the handout, which is exactly what I wanted to accomplish. I want to share, if there's those who want to take this a little bit further, I do have private classes and group classes. And it depends on what you need. I do specialize more on the portrait side of things, the working directly with clients side when it comes to the business side, and all basic things on the photography side. If there are some photographers who are professional photographers who photograph portraits, whether that's family portraits, individual portraits, not sports, I can do that, but that's not what I specialize in. It's kind of like the tools at the tool store. You may be looking for a circular saw, and I'm a hand saw. So yes, we're both saws, but there is one tool that's better for the thing you're looking for. So I may be it, I may not be it. There's a lot of photographers, a lot of teachers that think they can do everything. The more they think they can do everything, the earlier they are in their teaching career. They just don't realize that they aren't the expert in everything. And the more you do this, the more you specialize in certain things. And I generally specialize in people who want to work with professional portrait photographers who are trying to earn a living doing the thing that they're passionate about, photographing people. And I can do that for them. I can take them from the idea and the excitement to the reality of a business that's bringing in enough money to call it your career.
Great.
Melissa, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, so, and this is to everyone, is that we are going to, this kind of brings the next point up before we close. One of the things we are looking at doing is sponsoring a series of sessions with Jim that I think will be informative and helpful to everyone. It'll cover a really kind of, well, Jim, you want to kind of go into detail on what we've been talking about, looking at doing over the next, year starting in January?
We are going to be going into several different subjects, a lot more in detail. This is a very surface level class, and then it just kind of gives you an overview of the basics. There are so many more things, of course, we can talk about and go into extreme amount of detail with. Like we could isolate just shutter speeds and spend an entire 2 hours or however long we want to do this. We spend that entire time on that one subject alone. Then we can the next time talk about another f-stops. We can talk about color balance. There's several different subjects, lenses, how to photograph certain things that we're going to spend the entire time talking about that one subject, rather than this general one where we talked about a whole bunch of subjects and surface leveled everything. And so we're going to go into more detail with that. We have some things that are prepared, but we can also move in two directions of that are requested by the audience. Whatever you want to hear, please send that information to us. I've written over 100 classes, and so the likelihood that I already have a class written is pretty high. But 100 scratches the surface. I have 300 classroom hours worth of stuff that's written, and that to me is a scratching of the surface. Only because I've been doing this for a long time. Most people, when they say this, say, "Oh my gosh, that's a lot," and it is a lot. However, it's still a scratch on the surface. And if you request something that I can do, I don't want to do forensics photography, sports photography. There's a lot of things I don't want to go anywhere near. But if it's something that's in my specialty, my area of expertise, I want to present that to you. So feel free to make your suggestions, and we'll do that. That's going to be on Thursdays once a month. Which Thursday?
Yeah, I believe so, starting in January, and this will be separate from our regular first Tuesday. This will be what we call our first Thursday, or first photographer Thursday. It'll be more photography centric. Obviously, we'll touch on things relating to things like photographing artwork or stuff that would help an artist with things from composition. It'll cover, the sky's the limit on what it can cover, but it will be a photocentric type of course. And this is not to take away from what Jim's classes, because when if you take a look at or enroll in some of Jim's classes, then you really get into some detailed instruction that drills down into that, unlike what we could cover, in this type of Zoom setting. Before we end this, I think Marcy had a question.
Yes. Yeah, that's what I was trying to get to. But I have two things, actually. I'm going to give you Marcy's question, and then Jim, after you answer that, if you will go ahead and give information on where on the web they can find your photography school. So Marcy's question is, so you think a 55 millimeter lens is still okay for the large painting 4 to 5 feet?
In chat, I answered that, but it is, I wouldn't describe it as ideal though. So will it do it? Oh yeah, absolutely. If I don't want to spend any more money on lenses, I'm going to use that lens. I'm absolutely going to use that lens, and I'm going to be satisfied with the results. Can I get better? Yes, I can. If I spend a little bit more money on the lens, on the glass. So I would absolutely use that lens, and when I'm ready to invest a little bit more into it, that's when I get the more ideal lens.
And I'm going to go ahead and post the link to your website, because some people may be wondering, where can they learn more about the classes that you teach? And grab that link here.
So landersphotoschool.com. And I would recommend that you get on the email list. We send out an email with upcoming opportunities. And so when you go to landersphotoschool.com, just look up at the top right corner where it says get email updates. Click on that and add in your information, and you'll get those email updates.
And I'll also post it on our Facebook page, that link, as well as on the YouTube.
We got one
and
more
for
last
those
question. Coming in from YouTube, David also is asking, would you put a polarizing filter on the short telephoto if you use it for artwork photography?
Short telephoto. So he's probably talking about a 70 millimeter. Would I use the UV filter on? All right. So there's more than one way to answer that question. Generally speaking, I say yes to that. But if I have, it depends on the direction of the light as to whether I'm actually going to use that or not. For instance, if I'm photographing, well, let's go to an extreme. If I'm photographing a sunset, because the light is coming directly into my lens, I'm actually going to take that UV filter off, unless I'm at the beach, because then I don't want salt or sand to get onto my lens. But I'm going to take that off because I want fewer reflective sources. I've got enough that are in my lens already, all the different elements of glass in there. And so I'm going to remove that one, so I have one less reflective element. But if that's not an issue, then I am going to have my UV filter on.
Okay, thanks. That's a great.
Is that right? Was it UV filter that the question?
I think so, Dave. There's a little bit of a delay between Zoom and then
Between theirs and ours. Okay.
yeah. So if he pops in, I'll send that. I'll get that to you. This is great to have you on here, just because there are so many photographers. I mean, their art is already an investment, and trying to get archival also captures of their art, and then to go ahead and create prints is something they want to get done. But again, they feel limited, and because photography is also an expense there, and wanting to know what the perfect camera body, lens, and they just want to I just want to get that bare minimum to have my art going in. And what I love about your school, because I mean, when I was a kid taking photo classes too, they never taught you how to make money, art and photography. My mother was like, you're going to starve to death if you pursue any of these. But what I love about your school is that you actually do show people there is. I mean, you can command how much you get paid by how well your skills are, and that's something that I think your school does offer people. So if you really want to go ahead and get that money back in the cameras and the lighting and everything that you put in the software, taking classes through your school is great. And you have so many opportunities for people to kind of take a look at your school. So we're going to be excited to have, starting in January, having you doing a monthly video like this to help people with more details.
And there are, again, there's so many classes that people can sign up for, with Jim. And now, he's gone fully online. So he's now able to reach students that are not just here in the San Antonio area, but worldwide. And I think if don't worry, if you're not in the area, you can still take advantage of some of Jim's classes, and take advantage of the ones that we sponsor as well with Jim every first Thursday starting in January. And again, this was just kind of a little bit of a teaser to that, but we're looking forward to it. Any last words? I think we've gone a little bit long here.
Just a few minutes.
Jim, did you want to say anything?
If there are any, if there's portrait artists, either portrait meaning, and I'm thinking individuals and families who are with us today, I do a free portrait, a free session for those who want to do portrait work as their income source. Now, this is on the photography side, not on the painting side. But I'm sure there's some good overlap there. But this is for the photographers who want to do portrait work as their income source, whether they're new, aspiring, or maybe they're established. This is a free session. It's about 30 minutes. It's called a business assessment, and I've been doing it for years. But I put the link on the chat window for the Zoom, for those who are on Zoom, and it's Calendly, CALENDLY.com /photoschool 30-minute-appointment.
And I'll go ahead and post
That's a
it.
free 30-minute private session with me about your business and if you're heading the right direction or what to do to head in the right direction, and just point you in whatever direction it is you want to head, and define if it actually can cause you to get there.
And I posted those links both, or that link, or all the links on YouTube and Facebook, so people can access them there as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, and this will be
Awesome.
formatted for YouTube for playback later. It'll be up probably around Friday, and you'll be able to access it from Facebook and YouTube. And I'll have those links within the video as well, and within the comments section.
Awesome. Thank you.
Well,
Well, thank you guys for Jim. Thank you for doing this. James, as always, thank you for sticking around late at the office and doing that. And we want to thank everybody who got on Zoom and on YouTube and asking questions. We appreciate, your feedback and your participation. So we'll see you guys next First Tuesday.
right.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
And Jim, you right now are host, so you could go ahead and end the meeting.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Jim.
All right,
Bye.
bye, Jim. I will see you tomorrow, I believe.
That's right.
All right, I'll see you tomorrow.
Sierra's
My-
taken a lot of our classes.
My baby was born today.
Happy birthday, Neo.
No, not him. My client, my first client was born.
Oh, that's awesome. Congratulations
yeah, so
on
I'm
that.
nervous. So I'm looking forward to our meeting tomorrow because I got to do this. So
That's exciting. Heck yeah.
yeah. All right.
Wonderful.
Great class,
Thank-
guys. It was nice to meet you all. And thank you for your time, Jim. And I will see you tomorrow. Excited.
Bye.
All righty.